So this video is a follow-up to a previous one on questions involving the overall structure of a passage. In that previous video, I looked at questions involving two-part answer choices, meaning answer choices that take us, from one thing at the beginning of the passage to something else, the end of the passage. Here, we're going to look at some examples involving three-part structures. So we can see that just looking at answer choice A. It does this, then that, and then that. And if one of the answer choices has three parts, the others are also going to have three parts. Okay, so still, we want to be thinking this sort of template as we read and try to identify the kind of three main parts of the passage as we go. Another thing to keep in mind here is that something I've certainly observed on the actual test questions is that quite often you'll have wrong answers on these three-part questions that might even be 2/3 correct. Say the first two parts might be perfectly fine, but then the third part is wrong. So you have to be careful and read the whole answer choice. But anyway, what does this passage say? It says that the seabird species such and such has long puzzled biologists with its unusually erratic migratory paths across the Atlantic. Unlike other seabirds that follow consistent seasonal routes, this one often alters its trajectory mid-migration. Okay, so here I'm just going to say something like a scientific puzzle. I mean, something that has puzzled scientists would be, the paths, the migratory paths of this particular bird. But I think that's really the most important thing about this. It's something that has puzzled scientists. Okay, so we get to the next part. Some scientists have proposed that these irregularities are due to shifting ocean temperatures disrupting traditional feeding grounds. Others have attributed the phenomenon to wind pattern variability. Okay, so proposed solutions or answers, but solutions to that puzzle. And then here we get a transition, and that's usually an important thing in these passages. A transition word or phrase can signal that we're, onto a new part in the structure. And so, however, it says, recent satellite tracking and data modeling by this researcher suggest a more compelling explanation. The researchers are the birds are adapting their routes in response to dynamic prey distribution influenced by both temperature and wind. She concludes that birds' shifting behavior reflects a broader ecological responsiveness rather than navigational error. So what is this third part doing? It is laying out an alternative solution, a third solution, but one that the author or narrator thinks is better. And we see that, that opinion there. And it's certainly possible for a passage like this to not really offer any sort of opinion or perspective from the narrator. A lot of times they're just plain neutral, but here we do see that. So again, a little hard to read there. Let me rewrite that. And it's an alternative or better solution in the eyes of our invisible narrator here. Okay, so we get on to the answer choices. It describes an unusual behavioral pattern. Yes. I mean, an unusual behavioral pattern, that's a pretty good way of characterizing what we have here in terms of this scientific puzzle, these erratic migratory paths. It presents two common explanations for that pattern. I think that's right. Some have done this, others have done that. We don't necessarily know whether they're common, but I wouldn't use that as a reason to eliminate or to say that A is definitely wrong. The third part, however, you notice here that it doesn't really say anything about why both of them are inadequate. It simply moves on to an alternative explanation and says that that one is more compelling. And so that would be an example of one of those where it's 2/3 right, but it's still going to be wrong because we need all three parts to be correct. So on to B. It introduces an ecological anomaly. Well, again, that's just fine, right? Because an anomaly is a puzzle. It is something that scientists can't explain. It outlines competing theories for that anomaly and then describes a third theory that integrates elements of both. So here I would put a question mark, because does this third theory integrate elements of both? So what does the first one say? They're due to shifting ocean temperatures. The second one says that they're due to wind pattern variability. This says no, they are adapting their routes in response to dynamic prey distribution influenced by both temperature and wind. But their shifting behavior reflects a broader ecological responsiveness rather than navigational error. So I would still leave that question mark there. See if we can find something better. If not, it might have to be B. So answer choice C, it discusses a long-standing behavioral mystery. And once again, I think it starts out just fine, because if scientists have long puzzled over this, that means it is something mysterious and long-standing. And it is, yes, behavioral. So it dismisses two hypotheses that have largely been accepted, and then outlines a third hypothesis that the author favors. So here I would say that our first and third parts are really good, but I don't think that it really dismisses those two hypotheses. And so on to D, it describes a surprising scientific finding. And again, I still think that's okay, even though some of the others start out a little bit better. It's surprising in the sense that we have these unusual migratory paths and the fact that they alter their trajectory mid-migration. So while that first part isn't the greatest, compared to some of the others, I don't think you could call it wrong. It examines two potential explanations, yes, and then highlights a third that the author regards as more persuasive than the others, yes. And so this one, I will admit, being an unofficial question, is probably a little bit more borderline than what you would see on the official test, in the sense that I think they would probably refrain from giving you something that's this close to being correct. And maybe they would give us something a little better to start out answer choice D. But if we really put the microscope on that third part of answer choice B, I think what we could say is that that third theory doesn't really integrate elements of both, because those earlier ones are focused on things like ocean temperatures and wind patterns, so weather, climate type factors, whereas this is focused on prey distribution, even though that prey distribution is itself influenced by temperature and wind. So again, a little closer than you'd like it to be, but we can still point to those factors as evidence that the third theory doesn't really integrate elements of the first two. But now let's look at a second one here. And so we'll go ahead and do the same thing. We want to be thinking from this to that to this other thing. And so it says that for years, paleontologists have debated how herbivorous or plant-eating dinosaurs adapted their diets following significant climate shifts during the late Cretaceous period. So again, we have maybe not an anomaly or a puzzle, but at least a debate. So it's introducing a debate regarding something about these dinosaurs. Now, in the second part, what do we have? Well, it says that this researcher and her team hypothesized that as regional vegetation changed, these dinosaurs expanded their dietary range to include a greater variety of plants. So it gives us a hypothesis. And then it says that they tested the hypothesis by analyzing carbon isotopes in fossilized dinosaur teeth from multiple time periods and regions. And so here, is that still part of the second part of our structure? Maybe. It's a hypothesis and steps that they took to test that hypothesis. And then we get on to the last part. Contrary to their expectations, the isotopic signatures indicated that the dinosaurs' diets remained surprisingly uniform, showing no evidence of a broadened range of plant consumption after the climate shifts. So here we can say that it explains a sort of finding that contradicts the hypothesis. Something like that. And again, maybe we would want to divide it up a little differently, but I think that's a reasonable way to do it. We could adapt as needed when it comes to looking at the answer choices, but I think that'll be a good enough sort of foundation. So A says it outlines a long-standing scientific debate. Yes, because paleontologists have debated this for years. That means it's long-standing. It describes a research team's hypothesis related to that debate, and then notes how the team refined this hypothesis based on data collected. So let's read that last part again. Contrary to their expectations, the isotopic signatures indicated that their diets remained surprisingly uniform, showing no evidence. So if we're really reading closely here, we might notice that it's not actually saying anything about the team refining their hypothesis. It says something about the data collected, and we might perhaps correctly assume that they would eventually or subsequently refine that hypothesis, but that's not mentioned here. And so once again, we have an answer choice that is 2/3 correct, but we need it to be 3/3 correct, and so A is not going to be correct. B, it describes a long-standing controversy in paleontology. I'll put an okay there. I mean, it's not incorrect if it's a debate. I mean, it's a debate, a controversy. I mean, it's borderline, but I think it's okay. Does it list multiple hypotheses put forward by different researchers? No, it doesn't do that. Does it explain how recent evidence favors one particular hypothesis? No, it doesn't do that either. So here, a little bit nicer in that we have, an answer choice in which 2 of the parts are definitely incorrect. I don't think we really had that here. C, it introduces an unresolved scientific question. Again, a long-standing scientific debate, an unresolved scientific question. It presents a hypothesis developed by a research team to address that question, and then it reveals findings that undermine the team's hypothesis. Yes, because if their hypothesis was that they expanded their dietary range as regional vegetation changed, but they found that nope, they didn't broaden their dietary range, that means that the results undermine the team's hypothesis, and so that one is going to be correct. But what about D? It states a well-established principle about dinosaur diets. Doesn't really do that. They weren't seeking additional confirmation, and the data didn't support it. So that one's actually 0 for 3, and I think this one is probably a better reflection of what you'll see on the test, in the sense that, I mean, this is certainly modeled very closely on a particular question, but the other one was too. I just think that this one does maybe a better job in terms of, the sort of pattern that we might see. We're going to have our correct one. You might have one that's 2/3 correct, and then maybe the other 2 are a little more easy to eliminate because 2 parts of those are, 2 or more parts of them might be incorrect. But still, remember, we got to get all 3 parts correct in order to have the correct answer. And the best way to do that is to really be thinking structure as we go. Certainly, it's a different kind of reading that we're going to do on structure questions than we would do on main idea questions or explicit detail questions or logically completing questions. We want to tailor the approach to the question stem, and so that is that. So any questions, leave those below. I will make sure to include a link to the earlier 2-part structure video, as well as a video on structure questions involving poetry as soon as I'm able to finish that one.